Andrew sat alone in his penthouse, gazing out at the city below. The bright lights of Chicago twinkled, but to him they felt distant and cold. The noise of the city, the rush of people on the streets, felt like a world away from his empty apartment. He wasn't just alone in the physical sense, he was also alone in his heart. The divorce had been final just a few months ago, and despite all the success in his career, it hadn't filled the emptiness inside of him. He picked up his cup of tea and sipped it slowly, trying to quiet the noise in his head. His life had once seemed so clear: work, success, money, power, but now it all felt pointless. The warmth of the tea did little to ease the cold feeling that had settled in his chest. Is this really it? He thought to himself. Is this the life I've worked so hard to build? A sigh escaped his lips as he glanced around his sleek, modern living room. It was beautiful, immaculate, even, but it felt sterile, lifeless. The expensive furniture, the polished marble countertops, the priceless art on the walls, it all seemed so empty now. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but it had been his reality for so long. He stood up and walked toward the large glass window that overlooked the city. The lights were bright, the streets crowded, but it all seemed so hollow, in a way. It mirrored his own life. Everything looked perfect on the outside, but inside, something was missing. Something real. Something that truly mattered. He stared out at the city for a long time, lost in thought, until the hum of his phone broke the silence. He glanced down. It was another email from his assistant about an upcoming board meeting. The words blurred together as he read them. Another meeting, another proposal, another number to crunch. He was good at it, sure, but none of it brought him any joy. He dropped the phone onto the coffee table and ran a hand through his hair, staring at the half-empty glass of wine on the counter. He hadn't even finished it the night before. There was no one to share it with anymore. His wife, Emily, was long gone, and the loneliness that followed her departure had only deepened with time. A soft sigh escaped him, and he turned to leave the room. As he walked toward the door, something caught his attention: a sound. It was faint at first, almost like a soft sob, the kind of sound you might hear in the distance but can't quite place. He stopped in his tracks, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time clearer, a quiet whimper, almost like a child crying, but not quite. He hesitated, unsure whether to check it out or just ignore it. The silence in his penthouse felt heavy, and he hated it. The thought of the emptiness pressing in on him was worse than hearing something unexpected. His mind told him to go back, to ignore the sound, but something in his gut told him he couldn't, not tonight. Not when everything felt so off. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he moved toward the back of the apartment, trying to follow the sound. It was coming from somewhere near the hallway that led to the parking garage. He paused near the door, listening carefully. The sobs were faint, but they were there. Curiosity mixed with unease as he walked closer to the garage door. When he opened it, the flickering fluorescent lights of the garage greeted him, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The sound was louder now, and he could tell it was coming from somewhere in the corner. His pulse quickened as he stepped forward, unsure of what he might find. As he walked deeper into the garage, he noticed two figures huddled together near one of the concrete pillars. His heart sank as he realized they were children, two little girls, no older than 7 and 4. The older girl was holding the younger one tightly, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with fear. The little one, Sophie, clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, her lips trembling. Andrew froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. He was a man of logic, of business, of control. But this was different. He didn't know how to deal with a situation like this. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but nothing seemed to make sense. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, taking a cautious step toward them. The older girl flinched, pulling her sister closer. She didn't speak at first, just stared at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, suspicion, but also something else, something he couldn't ignore. She was afraid, but she was also strong. She didn't seem to want to show it, but it was there, hidden behind her eyes. Andrew knelt down, trying to make himself smaller, less intimidating. "Hey there, I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Andrew, do you need help?" The younger girl, Sophie, looked up at him with big tear-filled eyes, but she didn't speak. She just held her rabbit tighter, her little body trembling. The older girl still didn't respond, but her grip on her sister tightened. Andrew felt a pang in his chest, a deep sense of compassion that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, but it was real, and it scared him. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, The older girl looked away, her face contorting in pain. She didn't answer. Andrew's eyes flicked to their feet. Both girls were barefoot, their clothes thin and ragged, as if they had been out in the cold for a while. The silence between them stretched on, and Andrew didn't know how to break it. But then, just as he was about to ask again, the older girl spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit him like a punch to the chest. "Can you take her instead of me?" she asked, her eyes locked on his. The words stopped him dead in his tracks. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know what to say. The simple plea, filled with so much fear and desperation, hit him in a way he couldn't explain. He felt a tightening in his throat, the kind of feeling you get when you're about to cry, but you can't let it out. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice shaking. "What do you mean?" The older girl's voice cracked as she spoke again. "Please take Sophie. She's the good one. She never gets in trouble. She's the one who deserves to be safe." She pulled Sophie closer. Her eyes filled with something he couldn't name, regret, sorrow, a kind of brokenness that no child should have to carry. Andrew's heart twisted in his chest. This wasn't just a plea for help. It was something deeper, something more painful. The thought of a child offering up her younger sister to protect her was unbearable. He felt something stir inside of him, something he hadn't felt in a long time: urgency, responsibility, and above all, the need to do something. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave them here, alone in the dark. "Hey, listen to me," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "You're both coming with me. You're safe now. Neither of you is going anywhere alone tonight." "Not while I'm here." The older girl looked at him, disbelief mixing with exhaustion in her eyes. But something in her softened at his words. Maybe it was his tone, maybe it was the promise in his voice, but she didn't fight him. She simply nodded, and for the first time a small glimmer of hope flickered in her eyes. Andrew slowly stood, taking a step toward them. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around their small shoulders. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with a kind of raw, simple hope he hadn't seen in years. "Come on," he murmured, gently lifting Sophie into his arms. "Let's get you both somewhere warm." The older girl hesitated for a moment, then finally took his hand. Together, they walked toward the elevator in silence. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Andrew's chest, but he didn't want to think about it too much. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't leave them. As the elevator doors closed behind them, he glanced down at the two little girls in his care. Emily, the older girl, was still quiet, but her eyes had softened a little. Sophie had already fallen asleep in his arms, her small body curling against him for warmth. "Thank you for telling me your sister's name is Sophie," Andrew said, breaking the silence. Emily blinked up at him, her eyes tired but kind. "It's all we have," she whispered. Andrew didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he made a silent promise to himself and to them. "I'm not going anywhere. Not tonight. Not ever."
If you're enjoying this emotional journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this story. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. Your support helps this channel grow, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's share this story together.
When they arrived at his penthouse, it didn't feel like a home anymore. It was just a place cold and empty, with all its shiny surfaces and expensive furnishings. The girls, however, seemed to fill the space with their quiet presence. Andrew carefully set Sophie down on the couch, draping a soft blanket over her tiny frame. She was still clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face flushed from the cold, and her small hands curled into fists. Emily sat beside her, watching him with wary eyes, as if waiting for him to do something unexpected. He offered them snacks, crackers, and juice, anything that felt normal. It felt strange to him, too. He hadn't done anything like this in years. His life had been about business, about meetings and decisions that required a sharp mind. But this was something entirely different. Sophie nibbled on the cracker but said nothing. Emily didn't take anything. She just sat there, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the window, the faint city lights outside reflecting in her gaze. Andrew could tell she was tired, but he didn't push her to relax. He wasn't sure how to make them feel at ease. Instead, he busied himself, setting up a small area for them to sleep. The couch was too small for all three of them, but it was better than nothing. He had no idea what the right thing to do was. He wasn't a parent. He wasn't even sure how to take care of himself most days. But for some reason, he knew he had to make them feel safe. After he finished setting up blankets and pillows, he turned the heat up as high as it would go. The apartment felt chilly, despite the glowing radiators. The city outside felt so far removed from the small warmth inside. It was just the three of them now. A strange sense of responsibility washed over him as he realized this wasn't a temporary thing. He had made a choice. "You don't have to stay here," Emily said quietly, almost as if she were trying to protect him from whatever had brought them here. "We're fine. We'll be okay." Andrew sat down across from them, his back to the window, watching them as they stayed curled on the couch. Not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. He felt the pull of the weight of their words. The girls were still trying to protect each other, even though they didn't know him, even though they'd only just met. It hit him hard, how brave they were, how much they had already endured in their short lives. "I'm not going anywhere," Andrew said, his voice firm. He realized he meant it. Something in him had shifted since he'd seen them in the parking garage. Their fragility, their courage, it had affected him more deeply than he could have imagined. For a while, they sat in silence, broken only by the faint sound of Sophie's soft breaths as she drifted off. Emily hadn't moved an inch since Andrew had covered her with the blanket. Her eyes remained open, staring out into the night, lost in some thought that Andrew couldn't reach. He didn't want to push her. He wasn't sure what the right thing to say was. He felt out of place, awkward. This was supposed to be a night of quiet, of recuperation. He had no idea what he was doing, what he was supposed to do for them. He wasn't equipped for this. "Do you want me to call someone for you?" Andrew asked softly after a long pause. Emily didn't answer at first. She just shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around herself and Sophie. But then, after what felt like forever, she spoke, her voice so low he almost missed it. "No," she whispered. "We don't need anyone." Andrew swallowed. He didn't know whether to be relieved or concerned. He wondered about their story, about how they had gotten here. But he didn't ask, not yet. He wasn't sure if they were ready to talk about it. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. For the first time in a long time, Andrew felt the full weight of silence in the apartment. There were no buzzing phones, no meetings, no deadlines. Just him and two young girls, trying to find some sense of normalcy in a world that had already done its best to break them. He sat there in the dim light, letting the silence settle around them. Finally, he stood up, quietly moving to the kitchen to prepare something simple, a snack, maybe just to keep busy. As he moved around the kitchen, his thoughts drifted back to his own childhood. His mother had always said that kindness mattered most when you least expected it. When you felt the most empty, when you had nothing to offer, that's when you should show up for others. He had never really understood that until now. A half-sleeping Sophie stirred on the couch, her little body shifting. She opened her eyes for a moment, meeting his gaze. Andrew smiled softly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey, you okay?" Sophie nodded and let out a small sigh. She blinked a few times before nestling back into Emily's arms. It was a small gesture, but it filled Andrew with an odd sense of peace. For a brief moment, he thought about what his life had been like before tonight, before the noise, the success, the never-ending climb to the top. And now? He wasn't sure what the future held, but he couldn't walk away from these girls. He hadn't signed up for this, he hadn't expected any of it, but something told him he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the night went on, Andrew found himself sitting next to the girls, watching over them as they slept. Emily's breathing had slowed, her body relaxed for the first time since they arrived. Sophie's small hand rested against her sister's arm, and for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt like he wasn't alone. There was something about this moment, this quiet, unexpected peace that made him feel more connected than he ever had before. He stood up and glanced out the window again, but this time, the city felt different. The lights didn't seem as cold or distant. He knew things wouldn't be easy. They hadn't been for years. But tonight, he realized, things could be different. They could start over. The next few hours passed slowly. Emily eventually fell asleep, her hand clutching Sophie's tightly. The apartment was still, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft sounds of the city below. As Andrew moved toward the door to turn off the lights, he hesitated. There was no going back. The path he'd chosen wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right one. He stepped quietly into the hallway, the soft click of the door shutting behind him, marking the beginning of something new. In the stillness of his penthouse, with the city lights casting shadows on the floor, Andrew knew one thing for certain: he wasn't walking away from these girls. Not now. Not ever.
If you're enjoying this emotional journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this story. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from, and what part of the story moved you the most? Your support helps this channel grow, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's share this story together.
The morning passed quietly. Andrew didn't know what to do next, but he couldn't leave the girls alone in his apartment. His mind raced with questions, the biggest one being how he had ended up in this situation. He wasn't a father. He didn't know how to handle a child's fears, much less two girls who had clearly seen too much for their young age. But there was something about them, something about the older girl's bravery, the way she clung to her little sister that kept him from turning away. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow their lives were now intertwined. It wasn't long before Andrew found himself pacing the penthouse. The stillness of the apartment felt foreign, uncomfortable. He glanced down at his watch. It was nearly noon. He hadn't checked in with anyone at work yet. His team, his assistant, the board, everything was still running, still demanding his attention, but he couldn't focus on any of that, not right now. He thought of Sophie and Emily. He thought about the way they had walked into his life without warning, leaving him with a decision he wasn't prepared to make. He was used to decisions, he made them all the time. But this wasn't a business deal, a new product launch, or an investment. This was something else entirely. The doorbell rang, breaking him from his thoughts. He froze. It wasn't the delivery guy. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door cautiously, not sure who he was about to face. But when the door swung open, there was no one standing on the other side. Instead, a familiar figure was waiting, a dark coat hanging from his arm. Andrew stepped back instinctively, recognizing the man immediately. His mind raced as he processed the situation. It was Alex, the CEO of his company. "I thought you might still be here," Alex said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Andrew didn't speak for a moment. He felt a wave of exhaustion hit him. "What's this about, Alex?" Alex closed the door behind him and glanced around the apartment. His eyes moved quickly over the stark, modern furniture, the empty shelves. "You've got a lot of work to do, Andrew. A lot of people are counting on you. The board wants an update, and we've got investors asking questions." Andrew exhaled sharply. "I'm not in the mood for business right now," he said, his voice hoarse. Alex's expression softened, but only slightly. "I get it, but you can't just drop everything. You're the one holding this whole thing together. They'll have your head if you don't show up at the meeting this afternoon." Andrew's heart sank. He knew Alex was right, but he also knew he couldn't keep ignoring the fact that there were two little girls in his care now. Girls who were lost and scared and needed him more than anything his company could offer. He wasn't sure how to explain that to Alex. "Alex," he said quietly, his voice firming as he spoke, "I've got some things to deal with here." Alex studied him for a long moment, as if trying to assess whether Andrew was serious. Finally, he nodded, but it wasn't the look of a friend. It was the look of someone who was used to seeing Andrew run the show. Who wasn't sure what to make of this new version of him. "You know where to find me," Alex said, turning toward the door. "But don't think this can go on forever." Andrew nodded absent-mindedly, his mind already miles away. As Alex left, the apartment felt colder, emptier. The pressure of the world outside was always there, knocking at the door, demanding answers, but it didn't matter right now. What mattered was the family, even if it was just the beginning. He walked back to the living room, where Sophie and Emily were quietly playing, with some of the toys he'd found for them. Sophie was clutching her stuffed rabbit, still looking small in the oversized chair. Emily, on the other hand, was more reserved, her arms crossed as she watched Sophie. "Everything okay?" Andrew asked, trying to sound calm, though his mind was still in turmoil. Emily nodded, though there was something guarded in her eyes. "We're fine," she said, but it didn't sound like a statement of comfort. It sounded more like a reassurance to herself, a way to hold on to the tiny bit of control she still had left. Andrew didn't know what to say next. He wanted to help, to break through the walls they'd built around themselves, but he didn't know how. He wasn't even sure how long they'd be staying here or if they could really stay with him in this apartment. "We're just going to take it one day at a time," he said finally, more to himself than to them. "We'll figure this out, okay?" Emily met his eyes, her expression softening slightly. "Okay," she said quietly. "But we don't want to be a burden." Andrew's heart clenched at her words. She was only a child, yet she already thought of herself as a burden. "You're not a burden," he said firmly, walking over to her and squatting down to meet her eye level. "You and Sophie are safe here, and we're in this together, okay?" Emily nodded, though she still seemed uncertain. "Okay." Sophie looked up at him then, her wide eyes filled with a simple trust that made Andrew's heart ache. Thank you, she said, her voice soft. Andrew smiled gently, a real smile this time. You're welcome, Sophie. The rest of the day passed slowly. The girls stayed close to him and he did his best to keep them entertained. He wasn't a natural at this. He didn't know how to entertain children, let alone protect them, but he was trying. He made pancakes for lunch, even though he burned half of them. He laughed at himself, and the girls giggled, breaking the tension between them. By the time evening came, the apartment felt a little warmer. It wasn't the perfect, polished life Andrew had once envisioned. It wasn't the cold, controlled world of business meetings and expensive dinners. It was messier. It was quieter. And somehow, it felt more real. Andrew didn't know where the future would take him. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. There was a new kind of purpose in his life now, one that didn't involve profits or stock prices. This was about something much deeper, something he couldn't explain yet, but something he knew he had to follow. And so, as the evening wore on, Andrew sat down beside the girls, watching them as they fell asleep on the couch. The sound of their breathing was steady, comforting. It wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning of something new. And Andrew, for the first time in years, felt the weight of hope beginning to lift the heaviness in his chest.
If you're enjoying this emotional journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this story. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. Your support helps this channel grow, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's share this story together.
The quiet didn't last. For 2 days, Andrew managed to keep life simple inside the penthouse. The girls stayed close. Sophie followed him everywhere like a small shadow, still carrying that worn stuffed rabbit. Emily watched everything carefully, as if she were always ready to leave at any moment. Andrew tried his best. He burned pancakes twice. He learned Sophie liked strawberries but refused bananas. He discovered Emily barely spoke unless she had something important to say. And slowly, the apartment started to feel less empty. But the world outside Andrew's door wasn't patient. It caught up with him on the third morning. Andrew had just poured tea when the intercom buzzed sharply. The sound cut through the quiet. Emily stiffened instantly. Andrew noticed it right away. It's okay, he said gently. Probably just a delivery. But when he checked the screen beside the door, his stomach tightened. 2 uniformed officers stood in the lobby and behind them, a woman in a gray coat holding a folder. Andrew knew exactly what that meant. Authorities. Someone had reported the girls. He took a slow breath before opening the door. Emily was already standing now, gripping Sophie's hand tightly. Her voice was small. Are they taking us away? Andrew knelt down in front of her. No one's taking you anywhere, he said calmly. But even as he spoke, he knew things had just become complicated. A few minutes later, the 3 visitors stepped inside the apartment. One officer was older, calm-faced. The other younger, quietly observing everything. The woman in the gray coat introduced herself first. Julia Bennett, Child Protective Services. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it was firm. Andrew nodded politely. I assume someone reported 2 children wandering a garage. Julia opened the folder. Yes. Security footage from your building, 2 minors, no guardian present. She looked toward the girls. Emily instinctively stepped slightly in front of Sophie. Julia noticed that too. You've been caring for them since then? Yes. For how long? 3 days. The officers remained silent, simply watching. Julia flipped through the pages slowly. Mr. Andrew Lawson, CEO of Lawson Industries. Andrew didn't respond. Julia closed the folder slightly. You understand this situation raises questions. Andrew crossed his arms. I found them alone in my garage. Cold, hungry, terrified. Julia nodded once. That part checks out. Her gaze softened a little as she looked at Sophie. How old are you, sweetheart? 4, Sophie whispered. And you? 7, Emily answered. Julia crouched down to their level. Do you know where your parents are? The room went quiet. Emily looked at the floor. Sophie squeezed her rabbit tighter. Andrew felt the heaviness of the silence. Julia waited patiently. Finally, Emily spoke. Our mom, she said someone would come. Julia's expression changed. When was the last time you saw her? Emily swallowed. 3 days ago. Andrew felt a knot form in his chest. Julia slowly stood again. She turned toward Andrew. We'll need to place the girls temporarily while we investigate. Andrew's jaw tightened. With respect, he said calmly, they're safe here. Julia studied him carefully. This isn't about safety. It's about procedure. Andrew looked at Emily. Her face had gone pale. She wasn't crying, but she looked like someone bracing for something painful. Sophie whispered quietly, "Are we in trouble?" Julia softened a little. "No, sweetheart. Not at all." But Emily spoke suddenly, "We can stay here." The room fell silent. Julia turned to her. "And why do you say that?" Emily hesitated. Then she said the words carefully. "Because he didn't leave us." Andrew felt those words land in his chest. Julia watched the girl for a long moment. Then she turned back toward Andrew. "You're asking for temporary guardianship. I'm asking to keep them somewhere they already feel safe." One of the officers finally spoke. "They do look comfortable here." Julia exhaled slowly. She flipped the folder shut. "Temporary," she said firmly. Andrew nodded immediately. "That's fine." Julia continued. "We'll begin locating their mother and verifying background records." Andrew agreed, but he noticed something in Julia's eyes. Curiosity, maybe even respect. Before leaving, she knelt beside Sophie again. "Looks like you've got yourself a strong sister." Sophie nodded. "She always protects me." Julia glanced briefly toward Andrew. "And maybe now someone protects both of you." When the door finally closed behind them, the apartment felt quiet again. But this time the quiet felt different. Heavier, more real. Emily slowly looked up at Andrew. "Are we staying?" Andrew gave a small, steady nod. "For now, yes." Sophie ran forward and hugged his leg without warning. Andrew froze for a second, then gently placed a hand on her head. Emily didn't hug him. But she looked at him differently now, less like a stranger. More like someone she might trust. Andrew glanced toward the window. For the first time since they arrived, he realized something important. This wasn't temporary anymore. Their lives had already begun to intertwine. And the real story had only just begun. The days that followed felt like a blur. The initial shock of meeting the officers had worn off, but the reality of the situation had only begun to settle in. Andrew found himself constantly walking the thin line between his world, one that was driven by success, deadlines, and cold decisions, and this new world where every choice mattered, every action had weight. Emily and Sophie remained with him, but there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of the girls could hide. The walls they had built around themselves seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. Sophie was quieter, clutching her stuffed rabbit even more tightly than before, and Emily had become increasingly withdrawn, barely speaking to Andrew unless she had to. It was late one afternoon when Andrew finally received the call he had been waiting for but also dreading. It was from Julia Bennett, the child services worker. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice neutral, yet there was an edge to it that made Andrew's stomach tighten. "We found some information about their mother." Andrew stood up from the chair, his mind racing. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tightening in his chest. Julia paused before answering. "She's alive." "But she's in the hospital, Mr. Lawson. She's been there for several days now." "Her injuries are serious." Andrew's breath caught. He thought of Emily and Sophie, alone in the world, forced to face things no child should have to face. They had been abandoned, left to navigate the harsh realities of life without any safety net. His thoughts flashed back to the night they had met, the little girl's desperate plea. "Can you take her instead of me?" He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to collect his thoughts. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice quieter now, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Julia sighed. "It appears to be a case of domestic violence, Mr. Lawson. We're still gathering information, but it's clear that this isn't the first time she's been hurt. The girls were removed from her care because of the dangers she was in, but they're still her children. We have to consider their mother's situation as well." Andrew sat back down slowly, the realization sinking in. Emily and Sophie hadn't just been neglected. They had been exposed to violence, to a mother who had been trapped in a cycle of pain and fear. The weight of their story felt like a stone pressing down on him, one he wasn't sure how to carry. "Can you tell me more?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Julia paused again before responding. "We've confirmed that their mother's name is Julia Grace. She's currently in critical condition after being involved in a hit-and-run accident. She was brought in under the name Jane Grey, and when we found her, she had no identification. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but we're working to track down all the details. I know this is a lot to process, but I wanted you to know where things stand." Andrew's mind raced, but for once, he didn't know what to say. He thought of the girls, of their silent, broken faces. They had already been through so much. And now the woman who should have protected them was in no position to do so. Is there anything I can do? Andrew asked quietly. Julia's tone softened. Just keep being there for them, Mr. Lawson. These next few days are critical. We need to make sure that the girls are stable, that they feel safe, and that they have a chance to process everything that's happened. They're not out of danger yet. Andrew swallowed hard. I won't let anything happen to them. Julia was silent for a moment. I know you won't, but you need to be prepared. This could get complicated. The legalities, the custody, everything. Andrew closed his eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on him. I don't care about the legalities. I just want them to be okay. Julia's voice softened again. I'll keep you updated. We'll handle the legal side, but just keep doing what you're doing. Stay present for them. He hung up the phone, his thoughts swirling. There was so much he didn't know about the girls' past. So much about their mother's life that still hadn't been uncovered. He had always thought that his world of business and finance had given him control. But in moments like this, it felt like he was grasping at nothing. He turned around to see Emily standing in the doorway, her eyes wide as if she had heard part of the conversation. Sophie was behind her, clutching her rabbit, but it was Emily's face that caught his attention. She wasn't crying, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet sadness, a knowing that was far too mature for her age. Is she going to be okay? Emily's voice was small, hesitant. Andrew felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt down to her level, but before he could answer, Emily spoke again, her voice shaking slightly. We don't want to leave you. Andrew took a deep breath. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he needed them, how deeply their trust had begun to root itself in his heart. I'm not going anywhere, Emily, he said softly. You and Sophie are safe here, I promise. Whatever happens next, I'll be here for you both. Emily looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. Slowly, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't a full embrace, but it was a start. Sophie, still holding her stuffed rabbit, came closer too, and without a word, she sat down beside him. Andrew held them both gently, feeling the weight of their vulnerability, their need for comfort, but also the growing bond that was forming between them. Outside, the world seemed to go on as it always did, but inside this apartment, a shift had occurred. It wasn't just about keeping them safe. It was about being there for them in the ways that truly mattered. As the evening passed and the girls settled into bed, Andrew sat quietly in the living room, his thoughts heavy with the burden of everything he had just learned. He had entered this situation thinking he was offering them a place to stay, a safe haven, but in truth they were offering him something far more valuable, a chance at redemption, a chance to rebuild a life that had felt empty for too long. He glanced at the clock. The day had passed in a blur, but he was grateful for the quiet moments with the girls. They had begun to trust him, even if it was just a little, and that, he realized, was where the real work began. The days that followed were full of small moments that added up to something larger, something more profound. For the first time in years, Andrew woke each morning with a purpose that wasn't dictated by meetings or deadlines. It was dictated by two little girls who were relying on him, who had come to trust him in ways he never imagined possible. The girls were still processing everything. Emily spent her time sketching in the corner, quietly working through the turmoil in her mind by putting it on paper. Sophie, ever the innocent one, began to smile more. She'd started to trust the space they were in, and Andrew noticed the way her eyes would light up when he entered the room, no longer with fear, but with warmth. Andrew had learned so much from them in such a short time. He had learned what it meant to be selfless, to truly care for someone without expecting anything in return. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but it also gave him clarity. It taught him the value of love, a family not the kind of family defined by blood, but the kind built by shared experiences, care, and understanding. But the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. Emily had moments where her walls would return, where the scars from her past were too painful to ignore. Sophie, too, would sometimes retreat into silence, her hands clutching her rabbit as though it were her only link to safety. Andrew didn't force anything. He allowed them the space to heal, and slowly he started seeing glimmers of progress. Emily had stopped looking at him like a stranger. Sophie had started calling him Uncle Andrew, and every time she did, it was like a little piece of Andrew's heart shifted. One afternoon, a week after the CPS visit, Andrew received another call from Julia Bennett. I wanted to give you an update, Julia began, her voice much softer than before. We've been in touch with their mother's doctors. She's awake, but she's not well. She's going to need a lot of support if she's going to recover. Andrew's heart sank. He hadn't wanted to hear this, but he knew it was coming. Does that mean the girls will be going back to her? Andrew asked, his voice thick with emotion. Julia paused for a long moment before answering. It's still unclear. We'll have to assess the situation, but it's likely that if she can regain some stability, the girls will be reunited with her. But the decision will depend on what's best for them, Andrew. It's not a decision we take lightly. Andrew sat back, processing the information. His mind raced, but he felt an odd sense of calm wash over him. Whatever happened, he knew he had done everything he could for these girls. He had given them a safe place, and in return, they had given him the gift of purpose. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Andrew sat by the window, the city lights flickering far below. He thought of their mother, lying in a hospital bed, struggling to heal. He thought of the girls, and the small family they had become in such a short time. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered to himself. It was a promise he had made to them, and it was one he intended to keep no matter what happened next. The next day, the situation took another turn. Julia had called again, but this time she had good news. The mother has stabilized. She's being moved to a rehabilitation center where she can get the support she needs. After everything's been properly assessed, we'll consider the girls' future, what's best for them. Andrew felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't a resolution yet, but it was progress. Thank you, he said simply, his voice sincere. Later, as he looked over at Emily and Sophie, something inside him shifted. He had worried so much about what the future held for them. He had feared what it might mean for him if their mother came back into the picture. But now, he realized that the most important thing wasn't about what the future looked like. It was about what he had done in the present. He had given them something that mattered more than anything he had ever given before. A sense of belonging, of safety, of love. Emily, sitting beside him on the couch, looked up at him and spoke for the first time in a while. Are we going to be okay? She asked softly, her voice hesitant, vulnerable. Andrew smiled at her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Yes, Emily, you and Sophie are safe now. And I'm going to be here for both of you, no matter what. Emily nodded, her lips curving into a small, tentative smile. Sophie, who had been quietly playing with a rabbit, looked up and smiled too. For the first time in what felt like forever, the apartment felt like a home. It wasn't perfect, nothing in life ever was, but it was filled with the most important thing of all: love. That evening, as Andrew tucked the girls into bed, he whispered words that he never thought he'd say. Good night, family. And for the first time it felt real. Life often leads us down unexpected paths, ones we didn't plan for or foresee. But even in the face of hardship and uncertainty, there is always hope. When you open your heart to others, when you choose to show kindness and compassion, you might just find that you're not only changing their lives, but your own as well. Andrew's journey reminds us that it's never too late to make a difference, to start fresh, to rebuild what's been broken. The past doesn't define who you are, and the mistakes you've made don't have to be your future. Whatever you're facing, remember, giving up is never an option. There is always hope, always a new beginning waiting just around the corner. Keep going, keep believing, and never lose sight of the power of kindness, love, and human connection. Even when life seems like it's falling apart, remember, it's never the end, just a chance for something new. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what did you think about this story? Share your thoughts with us in the comments and help us grow this channel with your support. We can't wait to hear from you.